The physical boundary of an aircraft crash site is usually defined by a fixed impact crater, an underwater debris field, or a stationary structural footprint. But on the Welsh coastline off Harlech Beach, the geometry of the wreckage is dictated by a moving geological mechanism. The target is a highly intact World War II fighter, a Lockheed P-38 Lightning, widely recorded as USAAF serial 41-7677, the aircraft known as the Maid of Harlech. The investigation objective is entirely unconventional, not to extract the wreckage, but to secure a permanent, restricted perimeter around an airframe whose visibility is controlled by the beach itself, revealed by storms, then swallowed again by shifting sand. This is a non-touch survey operation defined by the extreme constraints of a dynamic intertidal environment. Definitions vary, but modern tallies place complete P-38 survivors in the mid-20s, with only a small handful still maintained as active flying warbirds. Almost all sit in climate-controlled museum hangars or on carefully maintained warbird flight lines. The Maid of Harlech is the outlier, sitting in the active intertidal zone of a Welsh beach where the shoreline never holds still. This placement creates a severe operational constraint for any investigative body. Aviation archaeologists cannot simply fence off the location or erect a permanent protective structure. The shoreline is subjected to relentless daily tidal changes, fierce winter storms, and continuous coastal longshore drift. For now, though the aircraft is buried, tomorrow, a storm surge could expose the entire twin boom structure to the open air. By next week, tidal currents could swallow it entirely again. The physics of this sand concealment dictate the entire protection strategy. Coastal longshore drift moves heavy, wet sand parallel to the shoreline, redistributing it across the shallows with each tide cycle. In calmer periods, the P-38's broad metallic shape acts as a fixed obstruction, and sediment piles against the fuselage, engines, and wings until the airframe is capped and buried. In severe weather, that balance can flip, and wave energy can strip sediment away fast enough to briefly expose the structure. That same cycle kept the wreckage largely hidden for 65 years, locked beneath a dense sand cap and absent from the surface. In the 1970s, shifting tidal channels briefly traced the outline, then the beach closed over it again. In 2007, the pattern repeated. Currents pulled the cap back just far enough to expose the twin tail booms and central nacelle of the P-38 to open air. Every time the aircraft breaches the surface, a new hazard profile is triggered. The immediate operational risk is human interference. The site is not signposted on the beach and is not promoted like a typical heritage attraction, but a suddenly exposed aircraft on a public shoreline is impossible to hide from local pedestrians. Artifact hunters and unauthorized souvenir collectors represent a severe threat to the physical integrity of the airframe. Removing even a single component from the cockpit or the engines destroys the historical chain of evidence and compromises the overall structural stability. A traditional forensic recovery could reduce the looting threat by excavating the site, lifting major sections, and moving the aircraft into controlled conservation. But in this intertidal zone, physical extraction introduces extreme mechanical risk, heavy equipment, unstable ground, and a tide line that never stops advancing. In practice, the strategy shifts away from immediate salvage and toward in-situ control. Document what is visible when the sea gives a window, define a protected footprint, and secure the site before the sand closes again. How do investigators lock down the perimeter of a massive airframe that repeatedly disappears beneath shifting coastal sediment? 55 minutes into a routine gunnery practice flight, a 24-year-old pilot crossed an irreversible operational threshold. On September 27, 1942, the pilot was operating a Lockheed P-38 Lightning at 6,000 feet when the left engine unexpectedly lost power. The immediate assumption was a propeller malfunction. The pilot aborted the practice mission and turned back toward base. But the failure was not mechanical. It was procedural. The operational constraint driving this failure was a fuel selection error. The P-38's fuel system demanded strict cockpit procedure, and investigators later concluded the pilot had remained on the reserve setting far too long, a mistake that can starve the engines even when fuel remains elsewhere in the aircraft. Shortly after the left engine quit, the right engine also stopped due to fuel starvation. Faced with a dual-engine flameout geometry, the pilot possessed no power to reach the airfield. The altitude and sink rate forced an immediate trade-off between a hazardous bailout or a controlled ditching. Recognizing the flat expanse of the Welsh shoreline, the pilot elected to perform a forced wheels-up belly landing. The aircraft struck the intertidal zone off Harlech Beach, sliding to a halt in 2 feet of surf. The ditching geometry was highly successful, and the pilot egressed the cockpit entirely uninjured. Following the crash, military engineers faced an immediate logistical decision regarding salvage. A memo from the Office of the Engineer Officer dated October 2, 1942, noted that damage from the crash landing and saltwater was extensive, and that salvaging the aircraft would require recovering the entire airplane. In the end, the nose guns were removed, and the wreck appears to have been left in place in the surf zone rather than fully recovered. Based on this engineering assessment, the military recovery team removed the primary weapons from the nose and deliberately abandoned the remaining airframe. The heavy structure was left resting directly in the path of shifting coastal burial. The military assumption was that the corrosive marine environment and the violent tidal action would quickly tear the remaining aluminum structure apart. That assumption was incorrect due to an uncalculated environmental mechanism. And typically, thin-gauge aluminum aircraft subjected to a seawater environment experience rapid galvanic corrosion. The saltwater acts as an electrolyte, accelerating the decay of dissimilar metals until the airframe dissolves or breaks apart. However, the P-38 sank rapidly into the dense beach sediment. This rapid burial triggered a form of intertidal preservation. Packed, waterlogged sand can restrict oxygen exchange and slow some corrosion pathways, helping an airframe survive longer than expected. But burial does not switch off chemistry. Corrosion can continue, just at altered rates and by different mechanisms inside the sediment. Instead of rapidly breaking apart in open surf, the aircraft's structure appears to have remained unusually intact for decades beneath the sand. The 1942 engineering decision to abandon the aircraft paradoxically ensured its permanent structural survival. The P-38 was locked into a highly preserved state, buried completely out of sight. But this pristine preservation also meant that the internal systems remained exactly as they were on the day the pilot ditched. The failure to switch the fuel selectors left a significant mechanical condition unresolved. If the airframe survived intact beneath the sand, what volatile hazards did it bury with it? Visual identification is the baseline requirement for any standard aviation survey, but optical sensors cannot penetrate a dense geologic cap. The primary operational constraint in Harlech is a severe sensor limit. In investigators attempting to lock down the exact footprint of the P-38 Lightning face, a physical barrier of 2 meters or 6.5 feet of heavily compacted waterlogged beach sediment. Because physical excavation is ruled out by the volatile tidal conditions and the rapid shifting coastal burial, traditional visual mapping is impossible. To secure the site without destroying it, the investigation requires a way to define the footprint without digging into the wreck. The intertidal setting makes excavation inherently destabilizing, and any invasive trenching risks damaging fragile aluminium structure the moment it is exposed. Instead, the approach is strictly non-contact. Record and measure the aircraft when natural exposure creates a window, and then use that evidence to underpin formal protection while the wreck is reburied. The decision was made to execute a subsurface mapping operation utilizing non-invasive geophysics to establish a definitive legal boundary before the wreckage could shift again. The survey design relies on tracing an invisible footprint beneath the tidal zone, but not by cutting into the sand. When the wreck is exposed at low water, investigators establish a controlled grid, tie it to fixed coordinates, and measure the extremities of what can be seen, using a total station and checkpoints recorded by GPS. A tape baseline and offset measurements can then be overlaid onto a scaled plan of a P-38, allowing the visible geometry to be anchored to the aircraft's known dimensions and orientation. The coastal environment still resists every step. Yet the working window is dictated by the tide. Lay out the grid, capture measurements, and pull out before the sea returns. And because the wreck may be rapidly reburied, the protected area must be conservative, wide enough to cover the aircraft and its associated deposits even as channels migrate. That is why the legal footprint is defined as a buffered zone, not a fence line drawn around a single day's exposure. This entire survey method represents a calculated trade-off. Investigators gain precise, geo-referenced documentation from what the tide allows, while accepting that many internal details will remain unseen under the sand. Yet, a digital map only secures the aircraft while it remains hidden underground. Mapping the perimeter provides data, but how is the physical chain of custody maintained when the site is suddenly exposed to the public? The operational baseline on the Welsh coastline shifted violently when a protracted sequence of winter storms battered the beach. The slow, controlled process of invisible footprint tracing was suddenly overtaken by a severe environmental time window. The extreme storm surge scoured away the protective layers of dense sediment, and the P-38 Lightning was abruptly thrust into the open air. This sudden exposure created an immediate crisis for the investigation team. The protective sand cap was completely gone, leaving the highly preserved aluminum airframe entirely vulnerable. Investigators possessed only a narrow, unpredictable window of time to physically document the site before the dynamic tides either destroyed the fragile structure or reburied it completely. Faced with this critical surface exposure, the Malvern Archaeological Diving Unit mobilized to the site. With the wreck visible at low water, the team carried out rapid, non-invasive recording, measured survey to fix location and orientation, systematic photography, and careful documentation of what the tide had revealed. To augment ground-level measurements, unmanned aerial systems were used to capture aerial photography and videography, generating three-dimensional visualizations from overlapping imagery. This aerial mapping strengthened the record of the aircraft's condition at the moment of exposure, creating a baseline model for future comparison without touching a single piece of the structure. However, capturing the visual data only solved half of the operational problem. The more severe constraint was physical security. The visual survey proved the airframe was remarkably intact, and that intactness turned the site into temptation the moment it became visible. A permanent barrier was off the table, but the tide would take it. That left the team with a dire chain of custody dilemma. They had to secure a highly visible historical artifact on an open, public beach without the ability to physically block human access. The solution was an exhaustion-driven trade-off. Instead of relying on static physical barriers, a dedicated local team organized surveillance and a physical presence whenever the wreck was exposed, maintaining watch over the site for months as conditions shifted. This was not casual observation. It required a disciplined roster operating through harsh coastal weather and coordinating coverage around tide windows and access on the beach. This massive expenditure of human capital was the only viable mechanism to enforce a secure perimeter. The historians functioned as a localized, organic security net. They possessed no legal authority to detain anyone, but their constant physical presence served as a psychological deterrent against theft or vandalism. By physically standing between the public and the exposed P-38, they successfully maintained the historical integrity of the wreck. The team held the line until the shifting coastal currents finally reversed their cycle, for dragging the heavy wet sand back over the airframe and safely concealing it once more. The operation was a tactical success, but relying on 120 days of volunteer physical surveillance is not a sustainable long-term conservation strategy. Could this temporary physical hold translate into permanent statutory protection? The pristine condition of the buried aircraft presents a severe operational risk. Because the ditching involved fuel starvation linked to tank selection, investigators have raised the possibility that fuel could still remain in parts of the system that were not being drawn upon at the end of the flight. During survey work, fuel filler caps on the inner wings were observed to still be in place, and small amounts of fuel were thought to possibly be leaking into the water, a reminder that the site may still carry an environmental hazard. That risk changes the entire security equation. Any invasive attempt to drag, cut, or recover the wreck risks rupturing preserved structures and turning the site into a spill on a public coastline. The safest management option is therefore not an aggressive salvage plan, but controlled in situ protection. Keep the aircraft where it lies, restrict interference, and treat exposure events as short windows for documentation, not extraction. The aircraft must remain exactly where it rests. Abandoning physical extraction, however, requires authorities to implement an ironclad method to prevent anyone else from touching the site. The solution must shift entirely from physical engineering to statutory enforcement. The baseline layer of legal security for the site falls under the Protection of Military Remains Act of 1986. Under UK rules, a license is required to excavate a military aircraft crash site, and unauthorized interference with military aircraft wreckage can constitute a criminal offense. That legislation provides a general shield against casual salvage, but the unique accessibility of an open beach still demands a more rigid framework to manage the surrounding archaeological ground. To establish an impenetrable legal touch boundary, KDW initiated a specialized statutory process and designated the site as a scheduled ancient monument, protecting not only the metal remains, but the defined area of ground in which related evidence may survive. Within that scheduled area, unauthorized works that would disturb the monument or the ground require scheduled monument consent, and carrying out such works without consent is a criminal offense. That decision set a precedent for aviation archaeology. By formally scheduling the P-38, KW established it as the first legally designated military crash site in the United Kingdom protected specifically for historic and archaeological interest, shifting it from abandoned debris to a regulated heritage asset. The boundary neutralizes the human threat by deterring looters and outlawing future salvage. But a statute on paper does not change the ocean's mechanics. Does a legal boundary hold any weight against a violently shifting coastline? In 2019, the scheduled status created a deliberate contradiction in how the evidence could be managed. Unlike typical monuments, publicized, marked, and mapped to invite visitors, the Maid of Harlech is protected by geographic obscurity. Its exact location is kept strictly confidential, with no fixed marker on the beach, because any sign would become a permanent target even when the aircraft is fully buried. The management posture is restraint. Minimize publicity, discourage curiosity, and keep attention on protection rather than visitation. The airframe rests exactly where it ditched over 8 decades ago. Following the extensive non-invasive recording operations conducted in 2014, the deep sediment cap naturally returned. At the time the site was scheduled, as the aircraft was described as entirely buried within the intertidal sands. Invisible from the surface, but documented through measured survey and recorded models that can be used as a baseline when the wreck is exposed again. Securing this specific outcome required a rigorous 5-year procedural transition. The critical optical data captured during the 2014 surface exposure had to be meticulously merged with the subsurface geophysical tracks. Engineers and aviation archaeologists utilized this combined dataset to prove to the government that the airframe possessed enough structural integrity to warrant national protection. They successfully argued that the physical context of the wreck was just as important as the metal components themselves. Removing the aircraft would destroy the unique environmental conditions that physically halted its corrosion. The resulting statutory designation in 2019 permanently validated this technical argument. This administrative resolution established a permanent baseline for United Kingdom military aviation archaeology. Historically, the metric for a successful historical investigation was the physical extraction of an airframe. Success meant deploying heavy lifting equipment, disassembling the wings, and moving a cleaned fuselage into a climate-controlled museum hangar. The Harlech operation proved a new operational standard. The investigation team achieved a definitive survey-only success. They mapped the complete subsurface geometry, verified the structural integrity of the airframe, and established an ironclad legal perimeter without extracting a single rivet. By legally separating the concept of ownership from the necessity of physical possession, they neutralized the strict threat of unauthorized salvage. The operation also proved the viability of in situ preservation as a primary management strategy. Rather than fighting the marine environment with industrial extraction tools, the investigators used the legal system to leverage the natural environment. The deep sand cap is officially recognized as the best possible conservation facility for this specific airframe. The investigators accept the strict limitations of this method. They will never physically inspect the cockpit instruments, they will not read the manufacturer data plates. And the exact condition of the trapped aviation fuel remains an unseen constraint. This is the calculated trade-off of survey-only archaeology. The team sacrificed tactile access to guarantee long-term structural survival. The P-38 Lightning will remain embedded in the intertidal zone indefinitely. The structural evidence is legally frozen in place, serving as an undisturbed primary source document. Future violent storm cycles will inevitably strip the sand away again, briefly exposing the distinctive twin tail booms to the harsh coastal weather. When that physical breach occurs, the local authorities will not need to scramble to define the perimeter. The 2014 geo-referenced record becomes the yardstick, letting investigators measure any new environmental degradation precisely the next time the wreck breaks the surface. The definitive legacy of this operation is not a restored aircraft on a runway. The legacy is a robust statutory framework that permanently protects dynamic crash sites, ensuring the physical evidence remains precisely where history deposited it.